Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is the first time we've done one of these events specifically focused on one of the functions that we feel is going very well at Jamie's Farm. This is a deeper dive into our impact measurement processes. And we are extremely fortunate here at Jamie's Farm because we've got two fantastic people leading in this arm of what we do. And you're going to hear from them a bit later on. I'm just here to introduce them essentially. But I wanted to say just a little bit about what impact means at Jamie's Farm. I've been told to keep this very short, so I will make sure I do that. We're very clear as a charity that we have no right to exist. There's no point in Jamie's Farm if we're not affecting long-term change for the vulnerable young people we're here to serve. So in order to make sure that's what we're doing, obviously collecting data is absolutely crucial in that. And associated with it, if we do it right, it allows us to inform the improvement of our program, which helps ensure that our impact measurement, our impact is as great as it possibly can be. So it's absolutely vital. It's core to what we do. And we have spent a long time in kind of developing our impact measurement. Some of that Chloe and Sam are going to go into greater depth on a bit later on. But we wanted to say a quick thanks at the start of this to some of the people who've helped us on that journey. And that there's a huge amount of people, too many to name in lots of ways, but a few people that I just wanted to highlight. Teach First in particular, when we were a part of their innovation partnership, were very clear that this was something that we needed to focus on. They helped us with our theory of change many years ago, and actually that really did help us focus our attention. We were collecting a lot of data, but we weren't being necessarily as targeted with it, and that made a big difference. But within Jamie's Farm, a lot of the practitioners who've worked on impact measurement have really added to that over the years. And we feel we're in a good place. As you'll hear from Chloe and Sam, there is more to do. There is always more to do on a farm. And certainly at Jamie's Farm, we keep moving things forward. And they're going to talk about that a bit later on. But it is something to celebrate where we've got to at the current stage. And hopefully it's something that other organizations can learn from. I just want to say a couple of bits of housekeeping. We're doing this on a what we think is a really good channel. It allows us to make this as interactive as possible, and we really would like to welcome as many questions as possible. We also have some polls up that hopefully you'll be able to interact with through the conversation that we have a bit later on. So please do put those in there, and hopefully at the end, Chloe and Sam will have some time to answer them. But I think it's just really important just to now, as the phone goes off, as I said, the fun never stops at Jamie's Farm, just to introduce the two main people who are going to be speaking to you. So I think it's worth saying at the start of this that both Chloe and Sam have worked on the Jamie's Farm programme. They're both ex-teachers, so they have a particular passion for working with young people, and that drew them into the farm. And actually, we were delighted with the impact that they achieved when they were working directly with them. So they know firsthand how important that is. And that allows them, when they're trying to improve the processes here on the farm, to do that in a really good way, because they know firsthand what it's like to be a delivery member of staff. Their experience generally outside of Jamie's Farm also lends them to being expert in this field. And they've really together driven forward our practice in this area. So I'm going to hand over to them now. I'm ahead of time. This is unknown occurrence. I had a few steely glances then just to make sure that was the case. But I'm going to slide out and allow them to take the floor.
Ooh. Before we start, we're going to blast a poll your way, because nobody that's been an ex-teacher would start a presentation without first understanding the needs of their audience. So I'm going to put a little poll on the screen, and it just asks you to rate your confidence in this area of impact measurement. It'll give us a chance to make sure that we're using the right level of jargoniness and the right tone.
Thank you, Sam. Excellent. So whilst you're doing that, I'd like to say another thank you. Thank you massively for joining us this afternoon. As Jake mentioned, it's the first time we've done a webinar like this that focuses on our impact. So we'd love to have your feedback afterwards. I think it's really important. We're going to talk you through today the kind of impact journey that we've been on. And I think one of the most important things to start with well, actually, I'll show you what we're going to talk about first, which is more important. So we're going to talk about our journey. We'd like to talk about some of the successes and some of the challenges that we faced over the last few years, and then to focus on what's ahead, so the future of our impact measurement. We're going to assume that most people on the call are kind of aware of Jamie's Farm already, so we won't spend ages talking about our programme, but just to touch on what the programme involves. It's a 5-day residential delivered at one of our 4, soon to be 5 residential farms across the UK. We take groups of up to 12 children and 3 teachers or members of staff during the week. These children are referred for a number of reasons. It might be poor mental well-being, low engagement at school, or poor attendance, or poor behaviour. We also conduct pre-visit and follow-up in the school. And at the moment, we're seeing 40 visits a year at 4 farms. So that's 160 visits per year, which is soon to increase. Usually we have an 80-20 split with our visits as well. So 80% come from mainstream schools and 20 come from other groups, such as families or unaccompanied asylum seeker children, just to give you a little overview. Our approach, again, I'm going to assume that most of you have some understanding of this, but we use a unique combination here of farming, family, therapy and legacy with the children that come to visit. So we find that the farming tasks, they're real working farms, each of our farms, so they're real tasks, they're not made up, and children get a sense of purpose, and they're obviously given lots of opportunities to succeed, which they might not have had back at school. The family aspect is really important. It was started by a family, JB and Tish. So all the children eat family meals together. They spend the week very much living together as a family. It's an extreme life swap for some of them. You know, there's no phones, they don't have their mobiles, they don't have sugary food, and they get lots of good quality sleep. There's also the therapeutic aspect. So we use quite a light touch therapeutic kind of approach with the children. There's one-to-ones, there's group work, and there's also horse therapy as well whilst they're here to try and get to the bottom of what's holding them back at school or home. And then I've mentioned our legacy. So the work we do back in school once they've returned to support them back in their usual environment. So very whistle-stop tour of Jamie's Farm, but hopefully that gives you a flavour. When Sam and I talked about doing this webinar, we talked about how we might format it. And actually, it was really easy to think, let's go straight into the numbers and figures and stats and graphs. But when both of us talk about the impact of Jamie's Farm, it always starts with a young person and their voice. So we thought, actually, what better way to start than actually hearing a quote from a young person and really focusing on what they feel they got out. This is a young girl who came to Jamie's Farm in year 7, and I was lucky enough to interview her last year when she came back to complete some work experience with us. So we talked about what she had felt on the week she did attend back in year 7. She said the farming work I really liked because we were working with pigs and animals, so you were prone to get hurt. So you literally had to do proper team bonding, which I always remember. You have to have trust in whoever is in your team or the teachers. Doing that type of farm work broke the ice between the teachers and students. By Wednesday, it turned to friends. And by Friday, I know for the majority of us, especially myself, by Friday, the teacher was a trusted person I would go to, which I really liked. So the way she described the relationships that built on the farm was really important. And then she went on to talk about when she went back to school. Without Jamie's Farm, I wouldn't have had that bond with my teachers. They really helped me. So when I fell back again in year 8, I was able to sit with them and able to have good trust in them. And they helped me a lot, which made me fix up my grades, focus in school, and not have outbursts as often. The bonds formed with my teachers at Jamie's Farm also helped me open up to other teachers, and specifically my form tutor. They allowed me to make a strong bond with her too, and without Jamie's Farm, that would literally have never happened. That was the starting point, like the source of my river. And without that happening, nothing else would have happened. I'd probably still have been bad and ended up being permanently expelled, which is a really good thing I wasn't. So she's now studying her A-levels and about to go to university. But I think it was really important to start with that and to show that relationships form such a strong part of our impact. And it's not necessarily all the things we capture in our data collection. We will delve into the numbers now. I think it's really important to do that. We're really proud of them. So these are our impact figures from our latest annual review. You might recognise them if you've seen it. You can see our 4 main outcomes are recorded around this slide. So improved well-being is a huge one. And of those referred to improve their self-esteem, 57% had improved 6 months after visiting. We reduced exclusions, that second one. Of those previously at risk of permanent exclusion, 75%, so 3/4, were no longer at risk 6 months later. Improved academic engagement, a really important one. Of those previously not on track in their core subjects, 64% were on track 6 months later. And finally, development of essential life skills. So as an example of that, of those referred to improve their independence, 85% showed improved independence 6 months later. That's just a taster of some of the things we collect. It's not an exhaustive list. We collect data from teachers and young people, importantly, before the visit, at the end of the visit, 6 weeks later, and then 6 months later. And it's obviously fantastic to have this data to shout about. We love having that positive impact. I think we have, there are 2 reasons to collect data and measure your impact. One is to be able to shout about it and prove you're having a positive effect. The second reason is to understand how it works and to develop and improve your programme based on your data. And that latter one is something we're getting better at. So we're going to talk about our impact journey, and I think we can't possibly start without recognising the period of huge growth and expansion that's happened at Jamie's Farm. So in 2010, we opened our first Bath farm here in Box. We saw around 250 young people that year. Fast forward to this year, we are now functioning with 4 residential farms, soon to be 5, and we are set to hit 2,000 young people this year alone. So it's almost a 10-fold increase in the number of young people we're working with per year. So you can see that's quite an important part of our impact journey. When you consider we're also collecting data around 3 or 4 time points on each young person, that's a lot of data that's being collected. So the first point I want to touch on looking back, so we're not going to spend ages looking back at the history, but I think it's really important we get to today understanding the context and why we've got to where we are in our impact measurement journey. Jake touched on our theory of change development. So a theory of change, I'm going to read the definition of what one is, just to be clear. So it's a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. So we are about to see the first iteration of our theory of change that Jake won't mind me sharing was something he came up with when we were applying for this big partnership with Teach First. So you're about to see it. It actually got us rejected from that partnership. It's a very lovely 3 paragraphs of writing just trying to depict why we have the impact on young people that we do. And Teach First quite rightly said that it wasn't clear enough and it wasn't a theory of change. So as Jake touched upon, I think it really focused our minds on how important this is and how important it is to get this right. So we actually enlisted someone from externally to come and complete a workshop with the whole organisation to develop our theory of change. Really interesting process. It started with collective vision, so trying to come up with our collective vision and mission, and then what success would look like. So what are the outcomes that you want to achieve if this is successful? And then working backwards from that to try and link what the outcomes are to what you deliver on the ground. This is our, I say final version. This is what we have now. It's not a final version. It's very much a working document. It looks pretty, but it's definitely something that we constantly refer to and make changes to when we need to. You can see down the bottom that these are the strands of our approach: farming, family, therapy, and legacy. And they lead through the various enablers which become and lead to our major outcomes at the top there. So it's not a linear process by any stretch. The enablers throughout the middle could be interchangeable in some cases. So we're aware of that. It's just a really logical way of looking at how your outcomes are achieved. So as I say, it's not a finished document, but we're very glad to have it. Looking next, we are going to delve a bit deeper into how we have measured our impact on young people specifically from their point of view. So looking at our developing more robust measures, shall we say, for pupil surveying. At the very beginning at Jamie's Farm, we started using some outcome stars. You might have seen these before on the left. So these were looking at confidence and resilience in particular. And then we wanted to align more strongly with our theory of change. We started using something called the MPC Wellbeing Measure. It was a measure developed by New Philanthropic Capital. And unfortunately, that folded after a few years, which really, it was a big learning curve for us. And we actually moved then towards a more nationally validated tool called the Shortened Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale to measure mental wellbeing. This is a validated tool. Although validated tools do have some limitations, they can be slightly inflexible, and due to the wording used and the length, we really feel that they are delivering something really important for us. So they are, you're able to benchmark very easily against other organisations and national data by using validated tools. You're also able to be sure that they are measuring what they set out to measure. So instead of bespoke questions, these are things that have been designed and tested. What's next for the future? We've also this year added the Delaware Social Emotional Competency Scale, which is another validated tool, and Sam will touch upon why that is later on in the talk. Next up, we got to 2018 and thought we were at a point where we really needed to take stock slightly and to think about, were we measuring the right things at the right time? And we employed some external consultants to look at just that. So we took on a external consultancy called Renaissai, who have lots of experience in the third sector, not to assess whether we were making an impact, but to assess specifically our impact measurement processes and whether they were fit for purpose. It was a really interesting process, and they produced quite a long report of shorter and longer term recommendations for us, some of which we've completed, some of which we're still working on. One of the examples was that we were using a relative scale for teachers to rate young people's behaviour, engagement and self-esteem in school, meaning that they were asked whether it had got better, improved or stayed the same, got better, got worse or stayed the same. We decided on their Renaissai's advice to move this to an absolute scale, a 1 to 5 point scale, to reduce subjectivity and to allow for more movement as well. So that's just one example of a change we made a few years ago that's been in practice. They also pointed out we needed to make sure that the enablers in the theory of change, all those things in the middle that lead to the outcomes, were being measured effectively. And that's something Sam's going to touch on in a moment, how we've improved that. The longer term recommendations were around control groups and developing a sampling strategy, which again, Sam's going to talk about some exciting developments about that in a moment. One of the things that was really reassuring at the end of their report, they said, we've been really impressed by the evaluation work at Jamie's Farm. You have robust data collection and analysis techniques, you're asking the right questions and are ahead of other organisations. So obviously very reassuring, but also we knew we had lots more to do. Finally, from me, we with the growth that we were experiencing, the number of young people coming to us, we knew we had to kind of scale up a little bit and come up with some systems that could better cope with the amount of data that we were collecting. And we were really lucky in 2019 to get the opportunity to pilot something called Impact Ed. So Impact Ed is a digital platform originally set out to work within schools, and it directly integrates with a school's information management system, which means it can capture data without manual input from teachers. So we all know teachers are extremely time poor, having come from teaching. Anything we can do to reduce the load on teachers, we knew that would improve our data collection rates and data return rates. We were one of their first third sector partners, so we had to develop the platform into a system that would work for us. And that's something that's been ongoing for a couple of years, but we're getting to a really good stage. And as I said, it means that all demographic information about pupils could be pulled through automatically, as well as things like attendance, attainment, behaviour points and exclusions data. It also allows us to track pupils for longer and makes control groups far more accessible because we have access to whole school data. So that was going really well. We'd got up to about 14 schools on the platform when a little bump in the road came along called COVID. And unfortunately, we were making great progress, but it definitely felt like this brought some really big challenges to the fore. And at this point, I'm going to move over a little bit because we were very lucky. Sam, as Jake touched upon, started working on delivery with us. She then covered my maternity leave in Impact, and then went off to work at Impact Ed and got a huge amount of experience working with lots of organisations using the platform. So we were extremely lucky and extremely pleased when Sam came back to us. And she's going to talk a little bit about how we've taken on those challenges since COVID.
Thank you very much. And first, I've been dying to cough the whole time, and I didn't want to interrupt. So I rejoined Jamie's Farm earlier this year, and we were facing a lot of challenges coming out of COVID, as were many organisations. And for me, there were three main challenges we were facing. The first was our data return during COVID was really challenging. We weren't getting nearly as much data as we had historically. There are perhaps some quite obvious reasons for that, school closures being amongst one of them. We also felt as though our measures were perhaps becoming a little out of touch. We were working increasingly to support non-school groups, such as virtual schools, children who are looked after, families, respite foster care, unaccompanied asylum seekers, a really diverse collection of young people. And even within the school setting, we were finding that the language, Chloe's taking control of the reins. Come on, Chloe, right, I'm taking it back. I'm going to be on clicking. We're going backwards. We found that even within school settings, some of the language that schools were using had really shifted to recognise some of the things that were underpinning bad behaviour, poor attendance. And that made us feel that the measures we were capturing weren't quite as well aligned with what we were actually doing as we wanted them to be. And the other is that there was a real change in baseline. We had such a period of challenge for young people, and suddenly we felt a real need to understand what would have happened otherwise for these young people. We were seeing, on average, positive outcomes for young people in what we felt was probably a backdrop of downward spiral and very negative experience. And so really understanding what that counterfactual, that otherwise would have looked like, became really important to our impact picture. Click. That's how you do it, Chloe. No, I'm teasing. So the first thing we wanted to do to improve our data return rate was to look at a new sampling approach. But at this point, I'm going to be really super duper clear and give an example of what I mean by challenging data return. So here on the left is one of the figures that we are really proud of. We helped reduce the risk of being permanently excluded. So those previously at risk of permanent exclusion, 75% were no longer at risk 6 months later. And this is a figure that we present every year, and it tends to be around this sort of percentage. But for the first time ever in our annual review, we had to caveat this underneath by saying that this was based on a sample of 16 young people in mainstream schools. So not only was it quite a small sample, those 16 young people represented only 17% of the potential number of young people we could have got this data for. So less than 1 in 5 of the young people who were at risk of exclusion were we able to follow up at the 6-month time point. And you'll also notice all of the data for this particular metric came from mainstream schools. Now, this figure was by far one of the lowest data return rates. For all our other figures, we had better, but still not really up to scratch data return compared to what we've ambitiously tried to achieve previously. We never historically would have dreamt of including a figure based on such a small sample size, and it did feel quite disappointing to have to put little asterisks next to it every time. But then we had to remind ourselves we were working in such challenging situations. Very often at the 6-month time point when we came to seek data, schools were closed, staff were off, staff within school and at Jamie's Farm were stretched in so many directions trying to support different young people. And we realised we can't just try and work harder to work our way through this problem. We needed to be more targeted. We needed to recognise the fact that the school environment and all environments supporting young people were incredibly stretched during this period and were likely to be stretched well into the future as we come out of this COVID era. So we thought, can we be a little bit more savvy? And we turned to one of my favourite techniques, which is called power analysis. And power analysis lets us ask, what sample size do we really need so that we have sufficient statistical power? So for those of you that don't like jargon, basically that means what sample size do we need? How many young people do we need to have data for so that we can analyse that impact data in a way that is robust and uses appropriate statistical techniques. So we know that we have enough data to ask questions in the right way of that data. Now, to ask this question, to do this power analysis, we needed first to think about which groups we wanted to be able to interrogate our impact for. We want to understand that impact on looked after children, on children from the north of the country, because we're opening a new farm there, and we want to make sure that our approach is as relevant for them. There are lots of different groups that we want to be able to ask, what is our impact like for this group? And so we needed to make sure that we had enough data for each of those groups. And historically, we realised sometimes we did, but other times we hadn't. We also needed to ask, what's the typical effect that we're having on each of our outcomes, on well-being, on risk of exclusion? And that information could go into our power analysis pot. And we were quite delighted that when we did this analysis, we realised that we only needed to be getting full quantitative data sets for 50% of the groups. It will be a very targeted and specific set to make sure that we were being representative across all those demographic groups, to make sure that we weren't introducing bias. Oh, they're our favourites, let's pick those. We wanted to make sure we were being really representative. We were still going to be hearing from every group with end of week surveys, speaking to teachers and young people, so we wouldn't lose any voices, but we were making sure that our effort was really focused and getting us the best data we could without trying to overstretch ourselves and potentially risk not getting the data back that we wanted. So this is something we've employed for this academic year. So having got our head around a good sampling approach that we wanted to take, feeling quite confident, supporting the delivery teams to take that forward, we wanted to address this second thing of, are our measures really in touch with what we want them to be? And Chloe mentioned earlier the importance of enabler outcomes. So these are the outcomes that are stepping stones of progress, not the ultimate goal that we're aiming for, but really essential steps along the pathway to reaching that goal. And they're a really important way of describing how Jamie's Farm works. And we didn't feel as though we were really capturing the essence of them quite right in our existing outcome measures. And so we got our heads together and we reflected that actually there are two main things that we offer through the Jamie's Farm programme. The one is a chance for a young person to find a more positive mindset. We offer a really calm and supportive environment and a chance for young people to really reinvent themselves. And they can take that then back home, give themselves a fresh start. The second is a toolkit of social and emotional skills that a young person can employ so that when they face when they're tackling a challenging situation at home, at school, at any point in their life, they have that solid, grounded mindset that they can access, and they have a range of new skills that mean that they can tackle that in a slightly better way than they might have previously. But how do we formalise that? That all sounds a bit waffly. How do we formalise that so that we can start measuring? And so, thankfully, we had already fallen slightly in love with a very well-established and regarded framework called the CASEL Framework. And this is a framework for social and emotional learning, and it has 5 substrands. They try to capture, and we feel they really nicely capture, some of the really important skills that young people need so that they can navigate their life really effectively. And we feel as though our programme helps develop these in young people. We also, you might have noticed I said 5 strands, and here there are 6. That's because we wanted to recognise that in order to deploy these skills effectively, you have to have the right mindset. And so we wanted to keep a focus on mental well-being as a 6th substrand to complement this CASEL framework for social and emotional skills. So this leaves us with 3 core strands in the things that we're measuring. We're measuring relationships, behaviours, and well-being. Under relationships, we have social awareness, and that includes the ability to empathise and recognise strengths in others, including those from diverse backgrounds. And then we have relationship skills. So that's the ability to establish and maintain relationships using effective communication, being able to seek and offer support and resist negative social pressure. And we were really excited that by having these two substrands of the CASEL framework, we were able to finally formalise this relationship strand, which so often teachers and young people and visiting staff were telling us were really important parts of what Jamie's Farm could offer. The second strand of the outcomes that we measure are under this behaviours area, and that includes self-management, the ability to manage your behaviour in an effective way in a range of different situations, and to show self-discipline, motivation, and drive to achieve your goals. It also includes responsible decision-making, which includes the ability to make caring and constructive choices about your behaviour and think about the consequences of your actions. To me, these two substrands forming our measure strand of behaviour are really great at capturing some of those school outcomes of reduced exclusions and improved academic engagement. To me, these two substrands of self-management and responsible decision-making are really key enablers of those school-based outcomes. But they're also great things to have in any area of life, making that previously quite schooly phrased area of outcomes a little bit more relevant for a wide range of the young people and organisations we work with. I'll just have a sip of drink. The third area is well-being, and that includes the CASEL Framework substrand of self-awareness, which is your ability to recognise your own emotions, to understand your strengths and weaknesses with a growth mindset so that you can look really optimistically towards your future with ideas of positive personal growth. And we have mental well-being, which we've always measured and we think is really essential to being able to apply these skills effectively back home. And we feel as though, like I said before, that this framework aligns really well with what we do. And we model these skills consistently throughout the week and give young people a lot of very structured opportunities to practice and develop these skills, both in a farming context, in a family context, and then also in one-to-one or small group therapeutic conversations. And then back at school, we follow up and see how they're doing back in the school environment. So we feel really happy taking this forward now, and we've started this year by reframing our outcomes so that they align with these three core strands of relationships, behaviours and well-being. So now I move on to talk about quite a tricky one logistically, but something that feels very important to us, which is establishing control groups. We've been very lucky that we have funding currently that's allowing us to extend our partnership with Impact Ed and really focus on developing good systems for getting control groups. But let's take a step back and first think about the context that led to us really wanting and needing control groups, and a little bit about what control group is and how we're going to go about doing control groups. And I'm going to give you an opportunity now to do a bit of stretching, jiggle your hands, and also to take a look at this other roadmap. So this roadmap is a little snippet of a roadmap that was included in our annual review. And it tries to give a flavour of the experience of young people during and after COVID. So I invite you to take 30 seconds to just have a look at some of the points on here and really reflect on the experience of young people during this period of COVID and since, now that schools and life is back to normal, I say in inverted quotes. So 30 seconds just to have a little look at this. So the reason I share this is that we were seeing more and more evidence, both directly from working with young people and from broader research and literature that said that young people were experiencing a decline. And a lot of the areas that we were seeing these declines in were really well aligned with some of the outcomes that we wanted to be seeing an improvement in. Here's an example of something we were seeing time and time again when we were speaking to teachers and visiting staff. As always, our time at Jamie's Farm was extremely positive for all the students and staff who attended. But one who stood out for me was Daniel. Daniel has had a difficult few years and has been slowly spiralling down. Whilst on the farm, Daniel had a huge smile, worked hard and played like a child again. Fabulous. This sentiment, the idea that the young person was on a negative downwards trajectory that Jamie's Farm prevented or even reversed, is something we were hearing more and more, and yet our data wasn't capturing that, because we weren't able to answer the question, what would have happened otherwise for Daniel or other young people? In fact, we were seeing quite positive shifts. On average, in all of our outcomes, we were seeing improvements, and these improvements were statistically significant. So I want to just talk you through this graph. Some of you will have already looked at it, boom, know exactly what it is. Others will probably hate graphs and will want a bit of explaining. So I want to make sure we have everyone on the same page before we move on. So for each of our measures that are based around a number, we have a similar graph to this. Along the x-axis on the base there, for this graph, we've got well-being. And this is measured using the validated survey tool, a series of 7 questions that Chloe mentioned earlier. On the very far left, that will be a score that is very, very poor well-being. The very far right, that'll be a score that's really high well-being. And there's a dotted line there, which is indicative of a point that research tells us indicates where young people below that line probably are experiencing clinical depression. Now, it's very hard to say, oh, a number can diagnose someone with clinical depression, but that's just to give you a flavour of what this might feel like, what different points on that scale might feel like. And wider research suggests that below that dotted line is a wellbeing score indicative of probable clinical depression. If we look at the orange shape, that's what happened, the experience of young people before coming to Jamie's Farm. You can see that quite a lot of the orange shape is below that line, indicating that a large portion of the young people that came to Jamie's Farm were really experiencing very poor well-being. The most typical well-being for people before the visit was at the top of that lump there, a middly low sort of score, with a tapering off and very few people experiencing the very top well-beings. But at the end of the week, we can see in yellow there's been a shift. There are far fewer young people below that dotted line experiencing really poor well-being. The most typical well-being is shifted to the right towards a more positive well-being, and we're getting a lot more people at that higher end than before. So this is great. We've seen a positive shift. On average, young people are moving from a more negative well-being to a more positive well-being just in that week of intervention. So we can probably say a young person has gone from the bottom of this spiral here, their starting point, to the top. Oh, we've had this much positive impact. And that's great. We want to be able to say that. But actually, when you're working in an environment where you suspect that young people are experiencing decline and would have potentially experienced quite poor decline otherwise, it's really important that we can try and capture that. Because let's take this second scenario. A young person starts in the middle there where those two spirals intersect. Following Jamie's Farm, they shoot up the spiral to the much more positive place at the top of that green arrow. But otherwise, they might have gone down that dark red arrow to a much worse place. And so really, we're not having that little bit of impact on the left. In this situation, we're having a much more positive impact, that larger orange bar on the right. The difference between where the young person has ended up and where they would have been otherwise. And this is why a control group is so valuable. Especially if you suspect that a young person might otherwise be experiencing a decline, and we had good reason to be suspecting that, you really want to be able to capture what would have happened otherwise so that you can attribute that impact to your intervention and to understand better about the areas that you're doing well and the areas that you need to improve on. So this led us to really focus on control groups. And there were two things that meant we really could focus on this. One, as I touched upon earlier, is some very generous funding that allows us to dedicate more time and effort to developing this approach. And second was our partnership with Impact Ed. As Chloe mentioned, Impact Ed directly integrates with the school's MIS. And so for our school groups, that means we can access anonymous data on the non-participating young people within the school. And by having that data, we can look for young people that might be well matched to those that come to Jamie's Farm. So what does a control group look like? Well, the control group is a group of young people where each individual within that group is matched to an individual within the participating group. So for every young person that comes to Jamie's Farm, we're finding someone that we think is as well matched as possible. And we're gathering data on them, and we're using that match control group as our best guess for the question of what might have happened otherwise for our participating young people. And we can match on various attributes, such as pupil premium eligibility, ethnicity, age, gender, prior attendance, behaviour points. We have lots of data like this that we're pulling automatically through Impact Ed from the schools that sign up to working with us on control groups. So this gives us a really exciting opportunity to understand what's happening in that school environment, what's happening nationally. That's going to be shown in the match control group and the changes we see in those young people. And we can use that as our best guess for what might have happened otherwise for these young people. And this is the first year where we've been doing this, so we're really excited to see what the data shows. But at this point, I think it's really important that we reflect on control groups generally. So often within this field of work of impact measurement, you get the sense that there's a hierarchy of data where everyone feels that quotes, case studies are a slightly weaker type of data, and control groups are the best type of data, with randomized control trials as seen as the real gold standard, in which you take a group of young people and you randomly allocate half to come to Jamie's Farm and half not to come to Jamie's Farm. We have a slightly different view, and as may you. For us, a randomized controlled trial is never going to be the way forward. We don't want to preclude young people from coming to Jamie's Farm if we think they're eligible. So we're not going to try and randomize and assign young people. It would also take away a core part of Jamie's Farm and what we do. We offer a lot of support in choosing a group that will create a positive dynamic, a chance for young people to reinvent themselves in a supportive environment. There's no point trying to do that randomly, taking that very important and critical part of our week and randomizing it. A randomized controlled trial is never going to work for us, and it probably won't work in most educational settings or interventions. However, what we're doing is still quite close to that. We're finding a very closely matched control group. Some people might say that's almost as good. And control groups, surely they're better than quotes. Well, I think it's really important to take control groups with a pinch of salt, recognise that they're a wonderful and really valuable piece in the puzzle, but they're not superior to other types of data. They're just a really excellent piece in the puzzle. To give an example of this, I want us to reflect on two individual stories. And as I read these individual stories, I want you to think to yourself, can numbers really capture what this young person is experiencing? Can we really use numbers to find and match someone to this young person and say, oh yes, that individual is going to really nicely capture for us what would have happened for this young person? Let's have a look. The first is Ezekiel. Ezekiel is very isolated and has until now tended to hold back and even come across as aloof and unfriendly. This week has uncovered a new side of him, someone who is keen to try new things, who loves to play, who enjoys the company of others, but also someone who is struggling deeply with loss of family and home. The best statistician in the world couldn't use numbers to find someone that matches Ezekiel's experience. It is so unique. It's at the fringe of what young people are experiencing. And so to say that control group data will capture Ezekiel's experience better than having a conversation with him is really naive. And so we will always use a complement of robust quantitative techniques with listening and hearing from the experiences of young people. Just one more example. of the types of young people we work with in this second quote. Sarah has been able to leave behind a very chaotic and stressful home life and friendship circle this week. She had very low self-esteem and felt a lot of stigma from being a looked after child in care. And we hope this week she's been able to see she can achieve as much and more than other young people not in this position. At this point, I'm going to start wrapping up, and I think we should reflect briefly on our key learnings. It's been 5 years maybe since we started at Jamie's Farm. Me working in the kitchens at Monmouth, Chloe working in Impact, and there's been a huge amount of change here. And there's something that's really wonderful about working at Jamie's Farm is that we're always striving to do better. And that's so true of this area of impact. So our key learnings, I think, are that impact data has to serve two purposes. You need to demonstrate your impact, but also understand it. And you can't understand your impact unless you're sure it's really reflecting the experience of lots of different people within your setting. It needs to support not just the mainstream case, but all the young people that you're working with. And it needs to be really robust and trustworthy, as you can't ask deep questions of it. The second is to think analytically about your sampling approach. It's so easy to say, oh, we must hear from every young person. We must represent them equally in the data. Let's give 100% effort to get all the data back. But actually, the time that goes into sharing data could be used in other ways. And so that's a really valuable resource. That time should only be invested if it needs to be invested. So think very carefully about your sampling approach. Be focused and intelligent. The third is to listen to your beneficiaries and organisations and don't be scared to adapt. We've done this by giving more focus to the relationship strand of what we're doing. But we've also got a really wonderful scheme called our Ambassador Programme, where we bring back a group of young people throughout the year who we feel have done really well on the initial programme. And we're looking to develop that so that we can use those ambassadors to really hear in a meaningful way about our impact and impact measurement. That's going to be really exciting. Watch this space area. Fourthly, take your time to get things right, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We teased Jake a little bit for that first 3-paragraph theory of change, but had we not done that, we wouldn't be in this position that we're in now. You have to start somewhere, and each time you make an attempt, you'll notice the things that are great and the things that, oh God, really, that isn't the right way to do it. And these things have to be done iteratively. It's much better to get something, get some data, start learning, rather than letting the enemy be the perfect be the enemy of the good. And finally, I think my favourite point, remember the value of qualitative data, of hearing from your beneficiaries and partners, especially when your outcomes are broad. You might not have guessed all the outcomes that you could have. And when your beneficiaries are at the edge of a typical experience, they're really going to be very hard to control for. How can you ask what would have happened otherwise when you're working with people who have got such challenging situations? So with that, I think it's worth just taking a nice deep breath. Thank you all for listening and reflecting on, we've had many years of growth, hopefully years of growth and development to come. We're really excited to be spending this year working on that new sampling approach, the new framework and control groups, working towards Skipton Farm opening next year, and then ultimately towards an external evaluation of our outcomes and impact in the year 2025. And at this point, I'm going to invite questions. Hopefully you've been putting questions as you go along, but in the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a little questions tab. So please do take a moment to type the questions in there if you're interested, and we will have a go at answering them.
Thanks, Sam. We have had a question which might follow on nicely from your talk about control groups. So is the control group a blind group, and are those pupils known to the school or just to Jamie's Farm?
So the control group is going to be, most of the people at Jamie's Farm who are actually working with the young people won't know who that control group are. They're never going to meet them. They're not going to see them within the school setting, but the school staff will know who they are, because ultimately we're looking to introduce more and more of our measures to those control groups. So that could involve things such as surveys. The ultimate dream would be to work closely with our partner schools and have some of these surveys embedded in the day-to-day of the school environment. I know some schools that partner with Impact Ed who routinely do a wellbeing survey with all young people at the start of the year. So at that point, if you had that, you'd not only have schools that had this really positive ethos around monitoring and tracking and understanding people's well-being, but you wouldn't need to tell the school who that control group is. But we're definitely at the phase at the moment of trying to just get the process, the sort of technical process with Impact Ed and teaching staff really nailed down. And then we'll start building up the number of outcomes that we have control data for. And then we'll start refining how we do this and trying to make it as unbiased and scientific as possible.
Thanks, Sam. Do add any questions you have got to that questions tab. We have got another one. So Tim points out those 2 quotes you used to illustrate were clearly summative, illustrative commentary from adults. Do you feel this sort of evidence is of more value than self-assessment from the young people themselves? And where does the balance sit in terms of measuring impact?
Oh, I love that question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Lovely question. Great question from you as well, Matthew. Sorry, I feel like I've been favoritist there. Both great questions. Shall I take this one?
Yeah. So I can add to it.
I'm on a roll now.
Yeah.
So I think we really care about hearing from both the young people and the staff. And other people if we can. You know, sometimes we can get case studies from other members of staff. And we make sure with every measure we get, we try to have a measure that is from the pupil, often a survey, a validated survey, and a measure that's from the staff. I don't think you can say either is better than the other. There are just strengths and weaknesses of each. I think where one big risk of hearing from young people is that we form a positive relationship with them. And they know, oh, they'll be pleased if I say I'm better at controlling my behaviour. Now I'm going to put that. There are lots of different potential biases you can experience when hearing from young people. But I still think it's really interesting to hear from the young people and to identify those areas where there is alignment between the teachers and the young people and areas where there's not alignment, because in that there could be quite a lot of learning if teachers feel as though, yes, these enablers have happened and that's why we're seeing this change, and a young person is saying, oh, it's because I'm really good chums now with Mr. So-and-so, that's why it's changed. That's really important to have for us to foster as part of our legacy work, that communication between the teachers and the pupils, so that they're learning from the data and they're learning about what each other are saying. So I think having both is really important, and we'll come to see what happens if we see this year we've really worked to align our measures so that for everything we have both of those pictures. So it'll be interesting to see how aligned they are and whether we have this challenge or not.
It will. And absolutely. And I think, as Sam mentioned, we're moving on to creating a kind of group of ambassadors that can give us some much more open and honest feedback on lots of our measures in general. So I think that will be really a helpful critical voice as well from young people. Okay, so the big question we've been asked is, what are the 3 biggest challenges facing the charity sector for monitoring and evaluation?
Yeah. That is a big. What are the 3 biggest facing the monitoring
challenges in the charity sector for monitoring and evaluation?
Well, do you want me to take? Should we both take a go at this one? Because I think, having worked at Impact Ed, I was doing that role early this year and at the end of last year, and in that I got to work with a lot of organisations, and I think for me, a lot of what we touched upon are some of the key things. Getting data back, but also knowing how much data to get back is a really big one, because you don't want to be spending hours and hours and hours of your delivery staff's time or your admin staff's time trying to get data back when you don't need to. But equally, it's a really hard environment. Teachers are so stretched. In fact, staff working with young people in any context are so stretched at the moment. And that's something that I think most charitable organisations trying to get data are seeing. That for me would be number 1. Do you want to do your number 1, and then I can try and do a
I mean, mine was going to be totally around data return.
Sorry, we should have conferred before.
No, I just think knowing that what's coming for teachers post-COVID, any charity that's trying to collect data from teaching and education in general, I think has to be really aware of the pressures they're facing and any ways of reducing the kind of ask on people that you're collecting data from is going to be really important, as well as the amount of data you're collecting.
Definitely. And I think for me, the this question of the counterfactual, what would have happened otherwise, is always going to be so hard. I don't think this is a new one. I think this is very long standing. It's always going to be really hard in the education sector, because there are such big ethical questions of running a perfect scientific trial. And there are such big logistical questions when it comes to like matching a young person. It's not like in a science experiment where you can match a mouse to another mouse, or something that's much more quantifiable. You can't interrogate and interview and understand, oh yes, you've had really similar experience to you, let's match. Most interventions want to support, or many interventions work to support the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged. So kind of by definition, they have an atypical and unusual experience. So I think trying to understand what would have happened for this young person otherwise is a really, really difficult question. And it's one that we're grappling with. I don't know if we'll ever be able to really capture it, but I think it's why it's so important to hear from young people, hear what they think would have happened otherwise, and also combine that with the best data you can get ethically and logistically. And I think that's going to be, the more that you work with the fringe and the very vulnerable, the very disadvantaged, the more of a challenge that's going to be. And yet in some ways, the more you deserve to be able to demonstrate your impact. So it's kind of a real catch-22, I think, there for organisations working to support those demographics.
Fantastic. Right, I think we've got time for one more. We've got a couple minutes left. Another pretty big one.
She finishes with a big one, I see. 2 minutes for a big one.
Well, not too bad, hopefully. It's, what is the lesson that you wished you'd learned earlier in your journey? And I think definitely, having Sam back and talking about our sampling approach, for me, I think it would have been, everything has been learning, but I think it's not trying to collect everything from everyone. I think that has been, a huge task, and something that if we had realised earlier something about that sampling approach, I think it could have created efficiency kind of earlier in the journey. But I do recognise that we've had to go through some of this to learn from it. So
it's interesting for you. It's sort of being more scientifically minded, whereas for me it's the other way. Coming from having done quite a lot of science in my history, my career. It's not really old in my history. It took me a long time to realise the value of qualitative data. It took me a long time to realise how much value there was in that, and using that to inform what you're doing. I was always looking for what are we going to do? What's our end goal? What is our finished product? Rather than seeing impact measurement as something that will be constantly developing. So for me, it's to be a little bit more laid back and fluid about the whole thing.
We're a good team.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, guys. I think we've just about reached the end. Just to let you know, we will be sharing the slides from this at the end. So when you get your follow-up email, there's also a very short survey. As it's the first time we've ever done something like this, it'd be great if you could take a couple of minutes just to give us some feedback. Let us know if you'd like something else in the future. And if there are any questions that you have burning that you haven't asked, please do email those across as well. We'd be very happy to answer them. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.